Today we are joined by Dr. Adam Rogers, who is an assistant professor in the School of Family Life here at BYU. Dr. Rogers graduated from BYU in 2012 with an undergraduate degree in family life before earning a master's and a doctorate from Arizona State University. After completing his PhD in 2017 with a dissertation on interpersonal relationships as a determinant of adolescent mental health, Dr. Rogers returned to Provo as an assistant professor. His research focuses on gender development in adolescence and encompasses gender identity, gender roles, obedience to gender roles, and the mental health of teenagers. Dr. Rogers was also the recipient of the university's Emmeline B. Wells Grant, which offers support for research and creative work with a focus on contexts and issues related to women's lives, and which made possible today's research. In 2019, he won the Emerging Scholar Best Article Award from the Journal of Youth and Adolescence for his article, Adolescents' Daily Romantic Experiences and Negative Mood, a Dyadic Intensive Longitudinal Study.
Dr. Rogers' initial research focus was on adolescent mental health, but he was quickly struck by the noticeable disparity between how mental health manifests in male and female children. He thus began studying the sociology of socialization. His presentation today will report the results of his recent research project on how the effects of early gender stereotyping and discrimination can shape girls' participation in STEM for years to come. Outside of academia, Dr. Rogers enjoys biking, having competed as a competitive cyclist during graduate school, and spending time with his wife and 2 toddler sons. Thank you for spending time with us, Dr. Rogers. The time is now yours to share with us how gender discrimination and stereotyping can shape girls' math and science motivations during high school.
Thank you. Is this my cue? Okay. Thank you, Aurora and Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I appreciate everyone, your time, your attendance, and your attention. Let me share my screen because my slides are on my screen. So, okay. The title of my talk, like I said, was how gender discrimination and stereotyping can shape girls' math and science motivations in high school. We are a very rapidly progressing society in terms of science and technology. Over the coming years, jobs in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM, are anticipated to grow at triple the rate of jobs in all other sectors. So STEM really is the future of our economy, and the anticipated growth in STEM will provide American families with millions of new careers over the next decade. A distinct challenge that we face, however, is that there is a very pronounced gender gap in STEM. Even though women earn 60% of bachelor's degrees, men outnumber women across most STEM degrees and jobs, including engineers, physicians, surgeons, university faculty, administration, technology. You get the idea. As a society, we have a very vested interest, though, in giving girls and women equal opportunities to pursue and thrive in STEM careers. And this is important for narrowing the gender pay gap, enhancing women's economic security, ensuring diverse and talented workforces, and also preventing biases or blind spots in the products and services that these fields produce. Now, the origins of these gender gaps are no doubt very complex, involving economic, social, and psychological factors. My research focuses on the role of sexism and discrimination in sustaining these gender disparities. Specifically, I am a developmental psychologist, and what that means is that my questions about sexism and discrimination are focused on childhood and adolescence. So, the guiding thesis of my work and of this presentation is that early life experiences with sexism undermine girls' interests and motivations in STEM, which contributes to the thinning out of the population of girls who maintain passion and STEM interests by the time that they reach adulthood. In other words, what I'm saying is that the gender gap in STEM is already well underway, even in early childhood and adolescence. So we asked the question, how does gender matter, right? I'm going to present some findings from my research about girls' experiences with discrimination and stereotyping, and how those things may be shaping their academic interests and motivations. But in order to do so, we need to provide some background and understanding of what we've learned about how gender comes to matter for children and teenagers. So, some background. What we've learned is that gender is one of the very first social categories that infants and toddlers learn to recognize. So as early as 24 months of age or 2 years old, children perceive differences between males and females, and this initiates a process of rapid but rather crude categorization of objects and people and events as either male or female. This process gains momentum so that by the age of 6 or 7 years old, children now possess pretty extensive, but also very stereotyped libraries of gendered beliefs. We call these extensive belief systems about gender schemas. Now, whether these gender schemas are accurate is another question for another day, but the point is this: from a very young age, children actively construct and develop belief systems about gender. Let me show you a quick example with a video.
Like that. So I recently sat down with a group of young people to ask them what the difference is between boys and girls. This is something I've actually been wondering about for years. And as you will see here, I got some exceptionally enlightening answers. What's the difference between a boy and a girl?
Well, boys like doing like rough sort of stuff, and girls like doing kind of like kind and soft.
Girls are gentle.
Yeah.
And boys are vicious animals.
Yeah. The boy has thicker hair than the girl.
Thicker?
Thick.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes. The boys wear a yarmulke.
Boys wear a yarmulke, right?
And girls don't.
That's right.
You can tell by the Adam's apple, because if they don't have an Adam's apple, then it's a girl. But if they do, then it's a boy.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Girls like pink, boys don't.
Sometimes boys like pink, and sometimes girls don't like pink, right? Yeah.
Girls shop a lot, boys don't.
Sometimes boys shop a lot, though.
Boys like to watch TV a lot, and girls don't.
They don't? I think some girls do.
This is hard.
Yeah, this is a difficult one. We could dance around this forever, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you and I, yeah.
Okay, as you can see, children have very established theories about gender and what differentiates the sexes. And as you watch, you can sense that they've likely picked some of these schemas up from their home environments, their school environments, or other social environments that they're embedded in. But what comes next is perhaps one of the most important discoveries that we've made in the field of gender development so far. These gender schemas, once they're acquired, act as a filter for the way that children perceive all ensuing experience. And I know that sounds a little bit abstract. What does it mean that they filter experiences? Think about what a filter does. Maybe there's two meanings of a filter here that could work. So some filters, like an air filter in your car, are designed to allow some things in and designed to block other things out, right? Another use of the word filter could be like on the camera of your phone. It colors and shades the way that you view something, the way that you see something. So when we say that children's gender schemas act as filters, what it means is that these schemas literally allow some things in to be internalized cognitively and mentally by the child, while also blocking other things out. Or it means that it can color or shade the way children perceive their environments, the way they remember their environments. So maybe that's still a little bit abstract, but let me provide you a few examples of this gender filtering phenomenon that we see in kids and teenagers. So in one experiment, researchers went to a couple of preschools and they played a game of memory with the kids. The children were split into two groups. In one group, they showed children pictures of people doing very gender stereotypical occupations. So for example, a male firefighter or a female nurse. The other group, children were shown pictures of people doing counter stereotypical occupations, such as a female construction worker or a male librarian. When asked to recall the pictures, the children in this stereotyped group recalled all pictures with almost perfect accuracy. They remembered both the occupations and the gender of the person who was doing the occupation. However, the children in the counter stereotyped condition consistently made two very common errors. They either forgot the occupations altogether or they distorted their memories, changing the gender of the person doing the job. So for example, they would remember instead of a female construction worker, they would have recalled a male construction worker. So their memories had changed. Children were using their personal theories about gender, their gender schema, to impose order on the images that they were seeing. Because most young children have very stereotyped theories about gender, the stereotypical images fit those theories quite well, and they were easily recalled. However, children struggled to make sense of the counter-stereotyped images, which did not fit their pre-existing theories of gender, causing distortions and deficits in their memory. Here's another example of how gender filters affect kids' perceptions. This is a video of me and my son. He's 3 years old, which means that he is early in the process of starting to develop his theories about gender or his gender schemas. I had noticed at one point that he was starting to develop this theory that teachers are girls, that to be a teacher was necessarily to be a woman. So I wanted to see how he'd respond when I told him that I was indeed a teacher. And this is how that went.
Guess what? Did you know that I'm a teacher?
No, you're a boy!
What? I'm a teacher.
You're a boy.
I'm a teacher.
Is teacher boys?
Teachers can be boys.
Okay, so you can see initially he's somewhat grappling with this new information because it doesn't immediately fit his pre-existing theories or schemas about gender. And in this way, gender schema are somewhat filtering the way he's trying to make sense of this new information. Okay, let me give one more example of this. Gendered schemas don't just filter perceptions and memories like we've seen, they also affect the way that children play and their play behaviors. In one experiment, this classic experiment, researchers took children individually into a lab and they presented them with 10 different toys. But the toys had been created by the researchers themselves so that they were new, or what we call novel in the discipline. And this was important because the toys had to be aschematic, meaning that children didn't have pre-existing perceptions about whether the toys were for boys or whether they were for girls. The 10 toys varied only in terms of how interesting and enjoyable they were. Some were very dull and boring, and others were exciting and interesting. Invariably, all children, meaning boys and girls, showed a strong preference for playing with the exciting and interesting toys. But then something really interesting happened. The researcher, after a few minutes of play, the researcher wandered back into the room and dropped a subtle but unmistakable gendered message. She would say, for example, if she was speaking to a boy, "I see you like that toy. I've heard that girls like to play with that toy and that boys like to play with those toys," as she pointed to the uninteresting and boring toys. And the researchers then would watch as the child would stop what he was doing, look at the toy in his hand, look at the boring toys that were now perceived to be for his gender, and then he dropped the toy like a hot potato to go play with the toys that he now perceived were for his gender. This happened for boys and girls. And this phenomenon, which has been replicated multiple times across various scenarios, has been dubbed the hot potato effect. In short, children will play with toys that interest them, but before they even ask the question of what interests me, oftentimes they ask the question, what's for me, based on my understanding and my theories of gender. So if there's a toy that they perceive is not for their gender, they will tend to drop it, avoid it, and even forget it as if it were a hot potato. And so the takeaway of all of this is that when children's environments make gender relevant, for example, when adults invoke gender as a meaningful characteristic of the present context or situation, that can lead children to rather innocently use their schemas to inform their choices, their behaviors, their perceptions, their memories, to filter their experience. Now, what does this have anything to do, what does this have anything to do with the gender gap in STEM? Well, knowing that children are constantly organizing and categorizing gender, and knowing how these gender schema filters are shaping their perceptions and behaviors every day, I am concerned as a developmental psychologist about the implications of how our society stereotypes intellectual abilities and abilities in academic subjects. In fact, there is some evidence of these patterns in schooling. For example, a recent study found that by age 6, girls begin to internalize a brilliance equals male stereotype, or the belief that exceptional intellectual ability is a male trait. Interestingly, the researchers noted that shortly after coming to endorse these stereotypes, girls began to show marked decreases in their interest and their motivation in math. The pattern here is the same that we've been seeing. Somewhere along the line, children acquire these gendered theories about intelligence, and these theories begin to filter and shape their emerging academic interests and their motivations during their early years. Findings like this convince me that the gender gap in STEM is already well underway early in life. It's for this reason that I developed Project Ahead, which is a project to examine these similar phenomena, but among teenagers. For example, how do teens' experiences with discrimination and stereotypes shape their gendered theories about intelligence, and how do these in turn affect their academic choices? Now, most research focuses on younger children, but I've gravitated toward a focus on teenagers because it's during the high school years that choices about academic interests and pursuits make the most direct impact on the opportunities that they're going to have in college. So today I'd like to share some of these preliminary findings with you from this study. I'm just going to present the results on the girls in our sample. We have boys and girls, but this presentation is mostly about girls' experiences with discrimination. So we have a sample in our project of about 300 girls. They're from all over the United States. They range in age from 14 to 17 years with an average age of 15. It was a relatively representative sample in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geographic region within the United States. We used survey questionnaires primarily to assess things like gender stereotypes, their motivations, and those kinds of things. So here's the information that we're going to be looking at today, the data that we'll be pulling from the project. And this is a little bit procedural and tedious, so please bear with me for 1 minute as I go through this. So here's the data that we're going to look at. So we have data on girls' reports of their gender discrimination. Girls reported on how often in the last 6 months they'd experienced things like unwanted romantic attention, demeaning jokes about their gender, being teased because of their gender. And we quantified these experiences on a numeric scale of 1 to 4, with higher scores representing more frequent experiences with discrimination in the past 6 months. Girls also completed an assessment of their academic gender stereotypes. So if you've heard of the concept of implicit bias, that's basically what this is. We used a word pairing task to assess their implicit or automatic cognitive tendency to associate math and science as being masculine or not. This allows us, like I said, to get at their kind of underlying unconscious gender schemas about math and science. Now, these two things, discrimination and implicit academic stereotypes, we then correlated with various aspects of their academic well-being. So, for example, we looked at their school belonging right here, meaning how connected they feel to their schools, their peers, and their teachers. School belonging is a really successful long-term indicator for how motivated students are and how far they go in their education. Students who feel more connected obviously perform better and go further in their education. So we also looked at subject-specific motivations in math and science. And we looked at 3 types of motivations that are shown in the science to be key drivers of engagement and success in these specific subjects. So we looked at level of interest in math and science, how much they value, meaning how important do they perceive math and science is in life, and then their self-perceived ability, meaning how competent and how good do you think you are at this subject. So interest, value, perceived ability in both math and science. When students are interested in a subject, when they find value in it, when they feel competent in it, those 3 motivations, then they're engaged, they're motivated, and they perform very well. Those were the primary kind of data or variables that we were trying to link in this study. But we also included some control variables. We controlled for various background characteristics like age, ethnicity, parent education. We also decided to control for this thing called negative peer treatment. Negative peer treatment is kind of like a measure of how much they get bullied or picked on. And the reason that that was important to insert as a control variable is because experiences of discrimination and bullying often overlap. And we're really interested in the unique effects of discrimination itself, right? So bullying is bad and discrimination is bad, but we have reason to believe that discrimination on being bullied on the basis of your sex specifically should have unique effects above and beyond just generally being picked on. So neither are good, but they're probably different in the effects that they have, or they at least have unique effects. So that's why we included it as a control variable. Okay, that's the procedural stuff out of the way. Let's actually look at some of the data and the findings from this study. The first pattern that I would like to summarize is the simple prevalence of gender discrimination that the girls in our sample were reporting. So in this table, and for me, it's looking kind of fuzzy and it wasn't looking like that before. I hope you can still see the numbers there, but you'll see in this table down here, along the rows are each of the 6 forms of discrimination that we asked them about. So we have, for example, unwanted romantic attention, embarrassing mean jokes about your gender, nasty demeaning names about your gender. And then down the columns, you'll see, for example, the response options. So never, several times, a few times, once or twice. So for example, unwanted romantic attention, it shows that 43% of the girls in our sample in the last 6 months had not experienced that. 23 or 20, about 24% said they experienced unwanted romantic attention at least once or twice. 20% about said a few times, and then 12.5% said several times. You add these three numbers up, it means that 56.6% of the sample said that at least once or more than once, they experienced unwanted romantic attention in the past 6 months. So some notable patterns across this table is that if you see the first four of these, unwanted romantic attention, embarrassing jokes about your sex, being called mean, nasty, demeaning names about your gender, and being teased about your appearance, those four were experienced by almost half or more than half of the girls in our sample. If you slice those data a different way, we found that 4 out of 5 girls, or 80% of the girls in our sample, experienced some form of discrimination, meaning at least one of those 6 in the past 6 months. And what makes this more troubling to me is that we know that children and youth tend to fail to perceive or deny most instances of discrimination that are directed at them. This is because discrimination is very psychologically distressing to admit. It's difficult to admit to yourself that you are the target of discrimination. So the fact that an overwhelming majority of girls in our sample are reporting experiences with discrimination means that for high school girls, gender discrimination is not only common, but it seems to be a normative experience, unfortunately. So the question is, what are the implications for girls? What are the implications for their well-being and specifically their academics? Let's look at some more of this data. Now, I realize that not everybody here will share the same training or understanding with statistical methods. So what I'm going to do is just present them both ways. I'll present stats and results, and then I'll kind of translate those into more practical everyday meanings. So here to start, these are the statistical results from a regression analysis looking at the effects of discrimination and stereotyping on school belonging. So here we have 3 indicators of school belonging: how connected they feel, how much support they experience from teachers, and using school resources, like how much access do they have to like a school counselor, or at least do they perceive. In the first 2 steps of this regression, we've got our control variables, our background characteristics, and we've got this control variable for negative peer treatment, right? So really what we're interested in here primarily is this step 3, looking at experiences of sexism or discrimination, and then their academic stereotypes. So as you can see, as you go across here, the asterisks represent statistically significant or non-chance effects. So looking across these tables, we see that girls who experience discrimination are at a so discrimination is a statistically significant predictor of lower levels of school connectedness, lower perceived teacher support, and lower perceived access to resources. And remember, these statistically significant associations come after controlling for negative peer treatment. So these are unique to just negative treatment in general. There's something unique about negative treatment specifically on the basis of your gender that's doing this. We don't find any statistically significant associations with implicit academic stereotypes or implicit academic biases. That's not terribly surprising to me because we're not quite talking about like these stereotypes are about subject-specific types of attitudes, and school connectedness is more of a broad kind of sense or feeling of connectedness to your school. So I'm not terribly surprised at that, but you know, considering well, let me translate this, I guess. Basically what this is saying is that a girl in our sample who reported experiencing more discrimination reported comparatively lower feelings of connectedness at school. They perceived less support from their teachers, and they perceived less ability to access and use school resources like their school counselors. And this makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, right? Girls who experience discrimination probably feel less welcome in their school environments and less connected to the people within those institutions. And once we consider how important of an indicator school belonging is for long-term academic success, this, I think, is an important finding. Now let's shift our focus and look at actual subject-specific motivations, right? These STEM-related motivations, because here's where we saw some of the more compelling results. As with last time, we controlled for background characteristics and negative peer treatment. So here's step 3. These are the associations between discrimination and stereotypes and math motivations. Remember those three: interest, value, and self-concept. And what we're seeing across the board here is that there's not really much going on. Okay, there aren't many statistically significant associations between sexism or stereotypes and their interest, value, and self-concept in math. There's only one, which is math value. So experiences of sexism mean that in general, girls are feeling less valuing of math. But here's where it gets really interesting. In a fourth step, what we can do is we can analyze the statistical interaction between discrimination and academic stereotypes. So what we're examining here with this fourth step, or this statistical interaction, is the combined effect of the two. In other words, this is like saying, what happens if a girl has a traditional stereotype about math being for boys and then experiences discrimination? What if she has both of those things? And this maps onto our theory about gender schemas, right? Discrimination is problematic for many reasons, but in part because what it can do is activate these underlying gendered filters that then can begin to filter and shape behavior. And this displays, well, when you look at it, this is where you start to see, so there are significant, statistically significant or non-chance effects across all three of those motivations. In other words, the interaction between discrimination and stereotyping is significant in all three cases, all three of those math motivations. Now, interactions can be tricky to interpret. So we usually, in our field, we typically plot them to make sense of what's happening. And so here's the plot for math value. And the plot was this very, very similar for interest and self-concept of ability. So I'm just presenting one plot. And let me just kind of walk you through how I plotted this. The plot displays three different groups of girls, each with a different colored line. So we've got the gray line represents girls with very stereotyped beliefs that math and science are male type subjects. The orange line represents the scores for girls who don't really have an implicit bias or implicit stereotype about math and science either way. And then this group represents a counter stereotype group. These are girls who have this implicit perception that math and science are actually feminine typed domains. And what you can see is that these three different groups of girls are all pretty much the same. They all report fairly high levels of math motivation or valuing of math when they also experience low levels of discrimination. In other words, when there's no or little discrimination happening, most girls value math to a high degree. Most girls have a high level of math motivation. Until, of course, they start to experience discrimination. The experience of discrimination, it seems, affects these girls very differently, as you can see from the lines beginning to depart from each other. The most negatively affected, meaning the biggest slope downward, was these girls with very stereotyped beliefs that math and science were for boys. They showed the lowest level at high levels of discrimination. They showed the lowest levels of math motivations. Girls who are less schematic or even who have counter stereotypic schemas about math and science, for them, discrimination is less potent in affecting their math motivations. So in other words, the effect of gender discrimination on math motivation is different for girls with traditional beliefs about math versus girls with non-traditional beliefs about math being gendered. Now, I should note that, like I said, the same pattern was true for interest, value, and self-competence in mathematics. So what do we think is going on here? Gender schemas, especially implicit schemas and implicit biases, can lay dormant until a certain event or experience activates those schemas. And discrimination may very well be that experience. It can make gender seem like a relevant feature of your school context. And once that happens, it can activate these gender schemas that can begin to powerfully shape and filter a person's perceptions and behaviors. Now, you may be wondering what happened with science. We did not actually find any statistically significant associations with science. So there were no interactions, there were no effects of discrimination and stereotyping. And I was a little surprised at that, but I imagine that that might be due to the fact that science subjects do vary more than math in how gender typed they are. So for example, subjects in the life sciences like biology tend to be less rigidly male stereotyped than things like physics. So there's a lot more variability within science overall, and our measures weren't sensitive to that variability. So we may have failed to detect some patterns there. Ultimately, more research is needed for science. But I think two takeaways we can safely conclude here is number one, gender discrimination clearly can affect a girl's sense of school belonging. And again, considering how important school belongingness is for the long-term success in academics, that's important. But also discrimination can indirectly affect her motivations in specific subjects, and specifically in this study, math, by capitalizing on pre-existing gendered academic beliefs, these implicit biases about math. Another way to state that would be that pre-existing biases about math, being a male subject, can be a distinct vulnerability for girls, because once those schemas are hijacked or activated, they can then begin to shape their experiences and their interests and motivations in math and science. So what do we do? All of this leads us to at least one important question. How do we intervene? What steps can we take in our schools and in our homes to help sustain the interests and motivations of girls who have a passion for STEM and STEM-related activities? Now, generally speaking, we've seen two approaches in our society, and they're represented by this comic, right? The first approach is to repudiate the notion that STEM is gendered. The second is to repackage STEM in a way that renders it feminine. The more common in our society seems to be the latter. For example, Lego has tried to increase girls' interest in spatial and building activities by rolling out a line of brick sets for girls called Lego Friends. The specific targeting of girls is made as obvious by the pink and purple packaging as it is by the very traditionally feminine role play and story narratives. Each set within Lego Friends is part of a fictional Heart Lake City, which is the home to 5 Lego female friends who do everything together, like go to the beauty shop, a cafe, a cupcake shop, a flower garden, a friendship bus, a kitchen, a beach house, and more. Other efforts have gone as far as making entirely different toys and marketing campaigns to attract girls to STEM. So a recent example is Goldie Blocks. This is a toy series that focuses on a female character named Goldie, who engages in solving various engineering problems, but in very feminine typed ways, such as building purses, making unicorn pillows, growing crystals, making friendship bracelets. Another and even more direct program, the Science Cheerleaders. Former NFL and NBA cheerleaders who now work in STEM professions will travel to schools and museums to give cheerleading performances where they encourage participation in science. In their pom-pom routines, these women will cheer in favor of science and against gender stereotypes, for example, chanting, "We're bustin', we're bustin', we're bustin' down stereotypes, go science." Then there's this program produced by the European Commission as part of their campaign, Science, It's a Girl Thing. And I'll just let you watch this one. See if I can somehow, okay. You get the idea, right? So high-heeled, highly attractive women trading seductive glances with a male scientist, cosmetics. Those of us in the field have dubbed these kinds of approaches pinkification, or the pinkification of STEM. Pinkification refers not just to the color pink, but any form of shrouding STEM or STEM-related activities with hyper-feminized stereotypes in order to attract girls' interest in STEM. Now imagine yourself as a little girl again. Would this approach have worked to make you more interested in STEM? Well, while we do need more research to see the overall effectiveness of pinkification, we're starting to see some clear patterns. From the available evidence, it appears that the pink approaches to STEM are at best ineffective, but at worst, iatrogenic. Iatrogenic is a medical term to describe attempted treatments that end up doing additional harm. In the handful of studies that we've seen on this, girls subject to these interventions actually respond with less interest in STEM activities and more interest in hyper-feminized clothes, activities, and toys. It appears that pinkification actually raises the perceptual salience of gender reinforcing traditional gender stereotypes and schemas, causing girls to attend more to the stereotype itself than the actual activity. It seems like these approaches, although perhaps well-intended, come with a certain risk for collateral damage. So what does work? All signs point to the altogether removal of gendered stigmas around STEM. Rather than trying to leverage stereotypes in cute ways, we're trying to make children aschematic when it comes to STEM, removing gender schemas around STEM. I admit that this is easier said than done, but it shows a lot more promise when done effectively. And I think we can go about this in a few ways in our schools and in our homes in particular. So first, in our schools, we can work to lessen the relevance of a child's gender in the classroom. An abundance of research has shown that there are no demonstrable sex differences in children's intellectual abilities or their learning styles. So we should seriously question why adults continue to insist on making gender a relevant feature of a child's academic environment. As an empirical demonstration, consider the findings from this study of preschool students. Researchers asked preschool teachers of separate preschool classes to use either gender-specific or gender-inclusive language. So for example, gender-specific language would include things like, "Good morning, boys and girls," or "Can the boys please line up first," followed by the girls. Gender-inclusive language would simply replace these boy and girl descriptors with words children and students. For example, "Good morning, children," or "Please line up, students." Now, throughout the 2 weeks of this classroom manipulation, children were given measures of their gender stereotypes and their preferred peers to play with. Findings revealed that children in the gender-specific, meaning the boys and girls condition, showed a significant increase in their endorsement of cultural gender stereotypes and decreased in their interest in playing with classmates of the opposite gender. Contrast this to the inclusive condition, where children showed no change and no increase in stereotyping or peer preferences during those 2 weeks. So what's going on here? Well, the answer is simple when you understand how children cognitively process gender. The teacher's persistence in differentiating between boys and girls makes gender salient or relevant, and thereby activates children's gendered filters, which we know naturally leads to the development of gendered beliefs and play preferences. I admit that at first it probably seems curious as to why the simple and almost natural tendency to say boys and girls may actually have negative effects in the classroom. But think about it this way. What would happen if teachers were to refer to their students using labels for race, saying things like, "Good morning, whites and blacks"? We would never, ever think to do this because a child's race shouldn't matter in the classroom, and this could only lend itself to stereotyping. So then why would we do this about gender? Because a child's gender also shouldn't matter in the classroom. Take another example about subtle gendering of our school context. This recent study showed that children in the United States are more likely to attribute boys' success in math to inherent ability or talent, while attributing girls' success in math to hard work. The difference is subtle, but it's unmistakable. He is smart and she works hard. Stunningly, the researchers found that these teachers' gendered expectations alone accounted for 50% of the emergent math achievement gap that persists through middle and high school. Differential expectations beget differential treatment. School systems from preschool through high school perpetuate cultural assumptions about gender and academic beliefs and about intelligence. And so addressing these assumptions and working to remove them is an important and needed step in narrowing the STEM gender gap. We also need to look how we parent our children in the home. The encouragement here is the same. Be mindful to not invoke gender in situations or contexts where it shouldn't matter. For example, one of the most common ways that we do this as parents is in the toy and play opportunities that we provide for our young children. You're no stranger to this. You walk into any store that sells toys and there are distinct divisions between toys labeled for boys and toys labeled for girls. Unicorn rainbow kitties in one aisle and fart ninjas on the other. In fact, recent research indicates that toys are now more gendered than they've ever been in recorded history. As a parent, I would encourage you to seriously question these distinctions. Know that play prepares children for life, and children need broad options. Toys are the means by which they practice and acquire the most fundamental motor, cognitive, spatial, social, and emotional skills. But that needed variety is lost when the adults in corporate worlds define some toys as for boys and others as for girls. Provide your children with a range of toys and activities that promote all types of developmental skills, and especially be mindful of the language you use in your home that may convey gendered meanings around their play and their toys. Remember the hot potato effect. Finally, be willing to have conversations in the home around gender issues and gender stereotyping. Some parents, in an attempt to provide gender neutral environments for their children, make the mistake of not mentioning gender at all, almost as if gender is too sensitive a topic to address. But the problem here is that children will, of course, be exposed to gender stereotypes through other means. For example, in the media and their peer environments, children and teens see women being sexualized, objectified, devalued, and intellectually degraded. Failing to talk about these issues with your children leaves them to navigate these stereotypic depictions on their own. And remember, for girls, discrimination and stereotyping are not the exception, they are the norm. And so our children really need our guidance. So how do we talk to our kids about gender? I'm convinced that one of the most effective tools at our disposal, especially for parents of daughters, is feminism. Feminism is an empowering ideology for many girls and women because it provides girls with a framework for making sense of the sexism that they will inevitably experience. In this way, feminism provides girls with a framework to help them identify harmful gender stereotypes, make sense of these stereotypes, and pursue viable alternative beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. The research on this is actually very clear. Teenage girls with feminist orientations more readily identify discrimination when it happens. They conjure effective and adaptive coping responses, and as a result, they are not as negatively affected by the effects of stereotyping and discrimination, compared at least to girls who do not have feminism as a resource. The findings from my data also seem to accord with this. Girls who saw math and science as a female strength, arguably a feminist orientation, were better equipped to handle the discrimination that they experienced, and they did not show the same academic deficits. So in sum, I've hoped that I've persuaded you that early life socialization bears a large responsibility for our current gender gaps in STEM. Through their childhood and adolescent years, girls are constantly exposed to stereotypes and discrimination, and these shape their gendered belief systems and thereby their educational and career pursuits. There's no silver bullet or panacea to close the gender gap in STEM all at once, but I believe that greater sensitivity and awareness to children's and adolescents' gendered environments gives us some of the best opportunities to begin making progress. We can strive to make math and science schematic in our schools, among teachers, and also in our homes. And I leave you here with the encouraging words of President Goldie B. Hinckley on this exact issue. He said, "The whole gamut of human endeavor is open to women. There is not anything that you cannot do if you will set your mind to it. I am grateful that women today are afforded the opportunity to study for science, for the professions, and for every other facet of human knowledge. You are as entitled as are men to the Spirit of Christ, which enlightens every man and woman who comes into the world." Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful and really informative. Thank you. We're just going to have a short response and then we'll open up to questions afterward. So, Dr. Adam Rogers' work involves data analysis pertaining to gendered experience in STEM. This empirical data illuminates stereotype threats by restricting female involvement in male-dominated fields. Recognizing barriers in the first step and adjusting how we individually respond. Recognizing barriers is the first step in adjusting how we individually respond to gender inequalities. The data presented validates that there's much we can do to increase opportunities for girls and women.
Question then persists as to why these gender stereotypes increase with continued age development. Dr. Rogers has explained that much of the current research on gender studies targets kids at a young age, which is helpful in understanding the danger of early stereotype threat. By studying older children, we can learn how to address the socialization of gender interests in STEM and the long-term trajectory of students. So now the time's open for questions.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers, for giving your presentation. So we're curious, so there's been a push towards raising children in gender-neutral environments. Do you think that this push will be beneficial in evening out the gender gap in STEM fields, and how would this influence gender schemas?
Sorry, you broke up on the very first part of that question. Can you rephrase that or restate it?
Yeah, so there's been a push towards raising children in gender-neutral environments. Do you think that this push will be beneficial in evening out the gender gap in STEM fields, and how would this influence the development of gender schemas?
Yeah, I mean, I do. It's part of the crux of my research is So gender neutral environments, what I prefer the phrase gender aschematic just because it fits more with these theories, but basically providing environments where children have a variety of opportunities to engage without the underlying beliefs that something is not for them or for them. So for example, when we look at toys, the reason that we care so much about toys is because toys give skills. Toys help children develop skill sets. And we can trace back STEM interests, like in college and high school, all the way back to early childhood, where people or children are gaining skills like through building with blocks and other kind of spatial toys. The problem is when we gender those toys, we're gendering the skills that set the early foundations for interests in moving parts and engineering and building things. And so, yeah, by creating gender neutral or gender aschematic environments, especially around toys and academics, what it does is it allows people to make their own choices without having to be filtered by these gendered theories and these gendered schemas all the time.
Thank you. So Brooklyn wants to know, in Project Ahead, did you analyze the difference in results for girls based on ethnicity? And did ethnicity affect the results of perceived discrimination and association of STEM subjects with masculinity? And Maya asks the same question, but with racial differences.
Yeah, so that is a limitation of our study, is that, so we did look at it as a control and didn't find that ethnicity had any impact on these associations. It didn't do much in its own. That said, we don't have a sample that it's representative on race and ethnicity, but it's not, I wouldn't say that it's a good sample for like looking robustly at ethnic differences, because our group sizes, our sample sizes within each of those different ethnic groups are not large. So the fact that we didn't find anything could just speak to the fact that we don't have large enough cell sizes and statistical power to detect those. So I hesitate to draw any conclusions about what our lack of findings there means. I think more research needs to be done. Good question.
Okay. Okay, and then Lacey asks, how can we find a balance between talking about gender with children while not letting it guide and form their gendered schemas?
I think there's a difference between labeling their environments gendered and just talking to them about gender stereotypes and issues. I think we can, and so parents struggle with this issue with race too, right? Especially white parents. We've seen that they are uncomfortable talking to their kids about race. And so they don't talk about race, but what that does is it leaves kids to develop their own theories about race, because they'll be exposed to race theories on TV, in the media, everywhere else. And the same thing is true of gender. So what we should be avoiding is labeling and orchestrating environments in a gendered way, but we should be able to have conversations from a very early age about what gender means, so that we can have these constructive conversations when we experience stereotypes, that we can deconstruct those with them, that we can talk them through those. So for example, you saw my son there in that video. He said, you're a boy, you can't be a teacher. But then it led later to a conversation, like the video cut out, but then it led to a conversation about, well, actually, boys and girls can be teachers. And those kind of conversations are ones that we want to revisit regularly. We don't have those conversations once or twice, but making that something that's open and that we can talk about over time as children develop throughout their years, because they'll be continuously experiencing gendered environments outside the home. So we need to be able to have conversations within the home.
Thank you. Okay, Haley wanted to know if you have any information about if boys are kept away from the social sciences for the same reasons.
Yeah, great question. There's another, so the other side to the story is the way that we stereotype arts and language arts and reading and writing as being primarily feminine. And we see that boys really lag in those domains. And there's really not been a whole lot of research there. And so that's another part of Project Ahead, is now we've done this with girls. We're going to start looking at how these stereotypes are affecting boys. So we have a lot of the same data on boys, their stereotypes, and we can track their motivations in like language arts and English and other subjects like that over time, and social sciences, social studies. So yeah, there's absolutely an opportunity to learn things there as well.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. So if a parent is in a STEM field, like specifically maybe the mother, does it influence the child to want to go into that field? So do you think that if a daughter has a mother in a STEM field, she's more likely to go into STEM, or more likely to have the idea that women can effectively and like participate in math and sciences?
Yeah. I've seen some data that suggests that daughters of women in STEM fields or in other professions where they're in positions of leadership or authority or status, those girls, the visibility is one thing, right? Being able to see women in those positions helps a girl to develop underlying theories about gender, that's possible for her, that's a doable thing for her. And so that can certainly shape a girl's beliefs. I believe also, I think women in STEM and women in those positions tend to be more feminist themselves and translate those to their daughters. And so those daughters wake up or grow up with more visibility around STEM, like seeing women in those positions, but also they may have more feminist socialization throughout their developmental years that can help that too.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to speak with us. Your presentation was really interesting and gave us a lot to think about. And thank you everyone else for your participation. And I think that's it for the meeting, unless Dr. Hegstrom has anything else she wants to say. So if we can just get one more round of applause.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.